Okay, welcome to the week after your first exam. I hope you felt good about the exam. I am going to have those graded hopefully by this Friday, and so you can have a better look at any questions that you might have on that. And I will make notes on the side of the questions if I see one that's missed, or I'll obviously talk about the essays. But thank you for getting those exams in, and we'll continue to learn in the second section as you head into the second half of the course. We're going to start talking about inequality and lots of different kinds of ways in which stratification plays a role. And basically to look at stratification as a whole and see how we have different layers of where people land socioeconomically, racially, gender, ethnicity, all of these different things that stratify us into different groups. And we experience that often from just experiencing our own lives. We often come up with labels to determine where we land in that stratification. And today we're going to be talking about purely the socioeconomic piece of that. Pierre Bourdieu said the function of sociology, as every science, is to reveal what's hidden. And so this is the fun part about sociology. We look and we don't shy away from the fact that we know that people are unequal and they don't have the same access to resources, and there are lots of reasons we have that issue. I would say that the number one thing that when we talk about social stratification, it's the ability for somebody to be socially mobile, moving up and down in the United States, a class system. There are other kinds of systems, caste systems, those types of things do exist. There's usually no social mobility in a caste system, but there are different ways in which we interact with different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And you have to think about it just based on a town. Think of the place you grew up. Were there places where you could see the resources were less? They weren't near grocery stores, or they didn't have the best grocery stores. Where your home, you notice the home life was very different. The size of the homes, the size of the yards, the types of cars. It's not rocket science. We recognize that we're stratified, and we actually lay ourselves out on grids like that. Very rarely do you see homes that are of different, economic worth sitting right next to each other. You usually see full groupings. If you look up at the top of the geography of a town, the topography of just looking at a map where to find a home, you can scroll over the top of that and you'll see just the difference in income levels. So social stratification involves that social mobility, whether or not we're able to raise, lower, change our social status, our economic position, and of course, power. Society, I'll remind you again, is a group of people who live in that particular territory where we're subject to a common system of political authority and we're aware of having distinct identity. But within society, we're stratified. And so we may have a sense of unity, for example, in the United States, even though we may be highly divided. When the Olympics come on, we recognize ourselves as part of that US society. However, we also recognize ourselves within the society in distinct groups. There is a sense of commonality, but there's very distinct differences in growing up in working class versus growing up in the upper middle class versus upper class. And then the 1%, which we'll talk a little bit, and I want you to make sure to watch that video. It's the only video for the week, but it's a very important video because I think it does a great job of trying to show what people really think inequality should look like, or at least, some levels that we know is expected versus where we're really at right now. And so please watch that video. But society is where we put that whole thing under these realms of feeling like we're part of society, but then we start to see the very different aspects of what that means. And so the systems of stratification kind of look like this. This is kind of a, crappy picture, literally, where you see at the very top, the super elite, the rich, the 1%, which in the video, we have 1% of the population of the world right now that owns 50% of the wealth and income. And so that would be the very top. And then the upper middle class is stratified below that, and the middle class, and then we see everyone else. And we see these things because we know they exist. We even ourselves may be trying to think about having social mobility out of the class that we currently are in. I would say this next generation is trying to break the class barriers a little bit more and not go after the American dream per se and have the big house and the cars and all the debt. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes over time. But the gaps of haves and have-nots, I think, will always have some sort of presence. And we study happiness index alongside GP or gross national product and gross national income these days, because when you're in countries that typically are a little less stratified, you'll often see the happiness index higher, and you'll often see a sense of the production being better. And so if you're an economist in this group, you'll kind of recognize that. Whereas when we're in times of feeling unhappy, there's a lot of times where that have and have not starts to show up. So social stratification is about inequalities, and it's about where we land on a scale of power. That's really what it is. It's how much power, how much ability for you to make something happen, and the ability for you to have the resources. Can you get a loan? Can you get, do you have a credit score that's at a certain level? Do you have friends or connections, a network? Do you have an ability for yourself to be part of the systems that will help you move forward in your career? And that's all power and prestige. And so the textbook says this is the structuring of inequalities between groups in society in terms of their access to material and symbolic rewards. And so, sorry about that. When we do this, we recognize that we ourselves are putting symbolism on different levels of living and how that looks. I'm going to take a pause for just a second. Okay, back. I always seem to get choked up when I'm talking, so sorry about that. The structuring of this inequality then becomes symbolic. Think about the ideal car, for example, that you want, and all the amenities that you may or may not want. Now, some of you may be like, no, we're not that type of person that really wants to have the car, the house, and all of that stuff. But there's something that you probably have outside of your reach right now. And typically that has a symbol of you making it or getting the life that you want. Could be a degree, could be paying off student debt. The thing is, the symbolism behind that is what we're talking about here, is that people, for example, will look at people who are in debt with student loans differently than they will look at people who had full scholarships and full rides. People will look at the ability for you to not work through college as a sign and a symbol of having a higher social status or being stratified in a higher income level, and people who have to work through college differently. So these are the types of symbols that we put on our sense of seeing those levels. There are three different types of things that go into that stratification. First is class or caste. Caste isn't something that we talk about a lot in the United States, but some people argue that we may be even in a caste system at this point, because there's a lot of people that can't get that social mobility between the different class systems. But that's a whole nother argument. Status, which we'll talk a little bit about, and then power. All of these are structured inequalities, meaning society's been built in a way where these inequalities continue to perpetuate. At this time, we are seeing an amazing gap start to present itself. Now, there's a lot of argument, what does that gap mean really for people? Is it necessary for the world we live in? Is it a particular gap that's happening right now while we restructure globalization? Those are really deep arguments that people will have, but to be honest, the structured inequalities are often inherited, and you are inheriting a system that is highly stratified and a class system in how people are put into categories and groups. And it's a result from social structure over time. And that's why when we look back in history, we try to understand what got us here and what are we trying to create now. So socially stratified systems a lot of times will be um, something that ranks categories of people based on common characteristics such as gender or ethnicity. We see that constantly. People's life experience and opportunities depend heavily on the social category they're ranked in, and you don't get to choose that rank. It's something you're born into, usually based on your parents or grandparents or families. The ranks of different social categories tend to change very slowly. Unless somebody makes a very strong leap in their family, which can happen, it's more of an anomaly than it is. We tend to stay in the same ranking systems unless we get ourselves at a higher educated level or access through other ways. By the way, education is the number one way in which you can socially move up and down the mobility chain. But mostly, if you lose education, if you stop going to school, your tendency to go down the social system based on class is a higher risk. And that's why people say, keep young people in school up to 8th grade at least. And we try to get people to sophomore year, because currently that's where we're standing for people being able to have some sort of a job that they can understand, read, write, do the instructions. And then the higher, obviously, education you get, you usually have not only a huge debt typically, but you have better chances. And once again, usually if it's a family and one person or two persons is making that stride, the whole family doesn't move out of that social class. Typically it's the person making those moves. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. These systems are based on degrading types of categorization. So this is a very clear point we have to be aware of, that in our United States history, slavery has been a major part of how that stratification began. People who were considered 2/3 of an individual and didn't have voting rights, women didn't have voting rights as well, but they were attached to systems, typically if they were white women, to systems where there was some representation, whereas slavery we see as a form of stratification where you're owned and your property. And so we see that as the very lowest level. And of course, with sex trafficking and trade, we see the sex trade and trafficking right now, even, for the labor market, where people are really running into issues of being bought so that they can be used for labor in other places. This is illegal in all countries as far as we call slavery, but it still exists, and it's still the lowest stratified place you can find yourself. And so the repercussions that we've experienced in this country continue to be experienced. Before we head into class and understanding the class system, a social system where you can't move up and down the ladder is called a caste system. And we see this most typically in India, although that country has made great strides to not be adhering to it as much, although marriage is still something very difficult if people are born into a certain caste or a historical caste is in their family for them to marry into another caste. But it's a social system where one's social status is determined at birth. So if you were born into the Sudras, unskilled workers, that's where you stay. That's the group that you marry, and that's the life that you typically adhere to. You make a certain level of income, and you have certain level of rights. Going up the scale, if you're the highest, the Brahmins and from priests, those traditions have a sense of that higher level. But as capitalism and other types of social trade have entered into countries where there have been caste systems, we see a blending of this with caste and class. But there's still a historical setting of people remembering, especially in a country like India that's so highly populated, that there is still that underlying idea that you were born into these and you can't move out of them. A caste society then is a society where you experience different social levels, and they are closed. If it's true caste, no individual can move in or out of a caste. They remain at that social level from birth throughout life. That's the big difference with caste and class. theories that look, by the way, at class stratification, and we're going to look at that first before we head into actually defining the different classes. A class you can be socially mobile with. It's, you know, the group that has usually an income bracket, size of home, and the type of access you have. Karl Marx, when looking at class stratification, would say that class struggles formed about how we distribute power based on the systems of capitalism, and that we basically set up these structures when industrial revolution and capitalism, and we started to also see the nation states develop outside of the kingdom societies into owners and workers. And so it's that strong proletariat bourgeoisie argument about who receives the funds, and then you basically we've ended up with a system where there's owners and there's workers. And that's, Marx would say, this is what has caused all the stratification and continues to do so today. He says that by the means of production, we are seeing ourselves, if you're the owners, you aren't involved in the means of production. You're not part of the material. You're not part of creating this, and also not seen as overhead. And so when you are a worker, you have a price attached to you. You have a sense of, you know, your worth based on what you produce. And usually you have a certain level of time that they will see you as a valuable worker. And it's not just about technology. It's all the social relations about the products that we make and the goods that we sell. And the means of production then mean that if you're a worker, which most of us are, it depends on the kind of class of work you're doing. So if you're industrial, you've got a certain price put to your work. If you're an individual business owner, let's say plumber, they can make a lot of money, but they also still have this caste kind of being plumbers. You know, it's not something you see high dollar plumbers anywhere, but as far as like, that's what people are aiming to be. But we need a lot of plumbers. They do make really good money. In fact, some of them make higher levels of wage earning based on their skill set needed than people that have gone through 4 years or 6 years of college, because certain things are put at different levels. For example, teachers. So you have to think about this as far as, what are we producing? Who gets to own the production, and who gets to do the production? And where do you find yourself in that? So it's that bourgeoisie owner, and that sense of that caste system. It's kind of like a system that's built on the expectation that the owners are going to make more money because they're providing this work life so that we can live. But when the gap widens, as it has and continues to widen, we see a lot more struggle. And Marx had predicted that, and that's what's often happening. And so we see ourselves seeing a surplus value, the value of the worker's labor, power left over with what the employer has repaid for the cost of hiring the worker, and then they get surplus value of that, and that gets usually reinvested in our society, sometimes into major schemes that lose tons of money, but the persons that get hit with that are not the owners typically. It's the worker. You lose jobs, you lose power, and we'll talk more about that. Weber, when he looked at class and how we work within the system, says he gives it a little less of a hit than Marx does, as far as this clear-cut war between the owners and the workers. Weber thinks that there's a lot to be said about skills and credentials, that there are certain skills and credentials that will give a person a higher income. Now, we can see that pretty easily. For example, doctors do make a lot of money. Surgeons make tremendous amount of money. There's a lot of folks that have certain skills and credentials that they have to pay for a lot of schooling. 2, they have to pay for a lot of insurance. And so therefore they are going to be expecting a higher income. However, the level of how much more they make, for example, doctors' offices have a lot of nurse practitioners now. Nurse practitioners are aiding in the very work and the skills. They don't make as much of a doctor, but we're starting to see more people even prefer to go to a nurse practitioner because it's cheaper for them to see the nurse practitioner than it is the doctor. Those skills and credentials in that section of, class stratification, even though a nurse practitioner on the class system is probably lower class than a doctor, their level of income might actually start to raise over time at a faster rate than doctors because people are starting to prefer them. Status including negative and positive. So that's important for us to recognize. Weber is saying, based on what society is doing, there may be some negative and positive stratification that's not just based on forever roles that are stuck into those class systems. People may choose to see things differently. For example, another thing you might think about is how if people were needing people on telephone lines at a particular time, the telephone linemen is what they used to call them. They go put lines up everywhere, and we still have those, but there's a lot of buried wire now. And with a lot more technology, we still have a lot of tech, but the ability to just have linemen with landlines, since that's going away, there's a negative to that. We see different kinds of tech coming in and different kinds of skills. And finally, again, Max Weber would say power is the cause, and that sometimes is something that is based on how much wealth a family might have, not necessarily skills. So skills and credentials takes certain people who access those abilities to do the tasks. For example, we give certain social levels of prestige to people based on their jobs. But as jobs change, and we're in a highly changing market when it comes to labor, what people are wanting and needing, we start to see different groups developing. One thing we do recognize, though, is those who are in the very poor, dirty jobs are often negatively privileged. And those jobs tend to be jobs that we really need. We need a lot of work done in them. So that's something to keep in mind. Finally, power is the ability of the individual of a member or group to achieve aims for further interests that they hold. So if you have a lot of power, usually you can make it happen. You can make things happen because you've got those connections. And people will even take higher risk on you because you've got that much power. And it gives them a sense of power if you succeed. It's the pervasive element that shapes all of human relationships in a lot of ways. People start to connect to each other based on power. And power is elusive because it's not always about money and wealth. It can be about politics. It can be about getting policy. It can be about just how a person feels their status in society and how they're cared for. So if you're stratified, let's think about it this way, into a lower class family, and you don't have much power because you don't have a lot of connections. There's not the education there. You don't have a sense of having a highly skilled job that people are competing for. These are the types of things that economists and sociologists alone would look at and say, what are the causes for this? Then there are other causes that are basically, we'll talk about this with race, ethnicity, and gender, that are out there from levels of inequality based on valuing humans based on what they look like and the types of basically what sex they are. Even if it's gendered, we talk about gender, we'll talk about that, but male, female, that dichotomy there and the level of power that's allotted there. So how's stratification then determined in a class system? There are 4 things: income, wealth, education, and occupation. Just remember those while, before what leads into the possibility, the power, and the class caste system that determines our status in a lot of ways. Income, wealth, education, and occupation are what goes into our understanding of how we land in class. Income is not the same as wealth. Income involves wages. It's a paycheck. It's what you get and you receive, and when you turn in your taxes, what you've gotten for the year, usually determined annually. And the textbook says it's money received from paid wages, salaries, or earned investments. So you can count your investments toward that. So that's income. That's very different. So it's your payday that you're thinking about with this. There's a lot of people that have high incomes, but they do not have a lot of wealth. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But, you're making good money. That's one good thing to determine that. If you look at these kinds of charts, we look and see where people's incomes land, household, $5,000 per each category. This is just something to give you an idea of how income is something that's often used. But income is not the whole story. Wealth is what you own. Oh, sorry about that. I had a typo there. When we have a paycheck, often don't save. This is a major issue in our society right now. But the other thing is some people don't have inheritance. They don't have land. They don't have inherited possessions that are of worth. And there are huge amounts of folks in the upper class, and especially the elite, the 1%, that have inherited so much wealth, and the income is not necessarily what their life is about. Their life is about maintaining that wealth and having things that are worth something. Well, the average person does not have access to that kind of wealth just to get into buying land or real estate. And that's why for a long time people said the biggest investment for you to move up the social ladder is to buy a house. Well, in 2008, market crashed. We had too many people buying houses, too many loans being given that were high risk, and too many people at the top end of the sector taking advantage of that. And although some went to jail, many people just took off with people's money and left us in a big hole. So what wealth is being able to maintain a sense of stability, even when you may have fluctuations of income or crisis in your life. There's a statistic out there right now that 39% of the United States cannot withstand $1,000 crisis in their life. That just says a lot. So the textbook basically helps us to understand this is money and material possessions held by an individual or a group, and they own it. And that's different than receiving a paycheck, because if you lose a job, that paycheck goes away. If you have wealth, it's there, and you can use it to gain or not gain. Race and gender does matter in wealth. When we see the major issue right now in our economy isn't necessarily about whether people have a paycheck or not that reaches a certain level. It's that they don't have the wealth to back up if they have major crisis in their life. So a lot of people are calling this the wealth crisis, not the income crisis. That we've seen so much wealth that isn't distributed well, that when crisis comes, it hits most of the middle class and the lower class and the working class in a way. And then, of course, the extreme poor, because they have nothing to stand on. And we've seen wealth drop in 2005 to 2010, which is our kind of 2010's our census year. Whites' wealth was down 23%. That's a lot in the United States. That's a lot. But when you throw in the category of Blacks, Latinos, and Asians, it was down 60% for those category groups. And so it just created this huge gap. And it's just a lot to rebuild that wealth. So it's the difference between this and this, an understanding of whether you're going to have a home that you try to maintain, and wealth. Those with wealth can do this a lot easier, whereas those who are just based on an income just don't necessarily have that. Education, again, it's the highest determiner of whether or not you can be socially mobile and gain wealth, because those who are educated tend to have the ability to get into pension funds, to get into ways of saving money that are based on the practice or given opportunity to, because of their level of education. They're given loans. They're given the ability to build wealth. Not all of it is, but that's something that education does. So what level you achieve in the number of years of schooling does make a difference. And it predicts whether a person's occupation or income later in life is going to sustain them all the way through it. Therefore, your occupation also plays a big difference in the status of your position. I don't want you to rank these. I do this in class, but that when I'm teaching face-to-face, but think about these, if you could, for a second. Are they all equal as far as a position, an occupation? Is the nurse the same as a physician or a mechanic or a teacher or a fast food cook? Now, it's really interesting. There are a lot of teachers that make less than a fast food cook once you put in the fact that they have to pay for their classroom materials, especially elementary school. So there's a lot. You have to look at the occupation, and that's a big determiner. Education level then moves into that sense of occupation. Class structure. These are the 6 major forms of class structure then that we see develop. Upper class, middle class with an upper and lower in the substratosphere of that. So there is a subcategory in middle class. Working class, lower class, underclass, and poverty. Let's talk about each one of those. Upper class is income of $180,000 to $880,800 a year or above. Approximately 5% of the U.S. makes this. Now, this is, remember, it's income. So it's not talking about the wealth that's added on to that. And typically, these folks will have a lot more wealth. So they have a lot of possessions. They have higher educations. They typically have a prestigious occupation. And the textbook will call this a class broadly composed of those more affluent members of society, especially those who have inherited wealth. And that's the big difference. Whether you've inherited something, own businesses, and hold large numbers of stocks. If you are not a person that has inherited a lot, usually you're not going to find yourself in the upper class unless you yourself build up to the income level and then are able to own property and types of things. So it can be done. We have seen people, the Koch brothers here, they inherited their wealth from a father that worked themselves up. Warren Buffett worked himself up from positions. So this is something. Oprah Winfrey, she went through the stratosphere with her, all of the different things that she's done. And I can't even remember who these people are in the left, sorry, but I think they're the Hearst family. I'm pretty sure that's the Hearst family. The upper class then is definitely a group of people that there's a lot of stories said this is pick yourself up from your bootstraps and you can end up here. Well, most of the time it's people that have inherited things, so that's not as much as possible. What most people think about as far as going at the stratosphere, even though you could be rich, I guess someday if all of you landed there, but really middle class is where most of what we see as wealthy is. A person that lives in Johnson County typically isn't a person in Kansas City. They don't necessarily, they fit the upper middle class. They may look like they have wealth, but there's a lot of times it's income that they're bringing in, and they haven't been able to necessarily reach over that wealth line yet. But so there's a lot of people that do. So not saying that doesn't happen. So that leads us to this. Middle class is composed of upper and lower, and a social class composed broadly of working white collar or low managerial occupations, meaning these are not the CEOs of a company, unless they may be a small company. These are really the people that are working at the higher levels of educated positions. In the upper class, of course, upper middle class, we're going to see that annual year income be $100,000 to $180,000 a year. You own a nice house. This is 20% of Americans in 2010. That continues to fluctuate over time. And then the lower class, lower middle class is $38,000 to $100,000 a year. Usually have a modest house. You may rent. Your autos are usually pretty practical. You don't see yourselves in Mercedes, BMWs as much as you see. You may have a nicer Chevy or a nicer Ford. You may have an SUV or something like that. This is 40% of Americans. And so we see diversification, trying to look like we're part of that pretty making it family. Of course, these are representations, and these kind of pictures always creep me out a little bit, to be honest, where people are showing off all their wealth. But this is that sense of the status. And then for the lower, middle class, it's the neighborhood. It's what people, the picket fence and the front porch and those types of things. Again, ideals that have been set by the idea of what we're supposed to be reaching for, but not necessarily what people in reality are doing. The working class is a social class that's broadly composed of people working blue collar in manual occupation jobs. It's about 20% of our population, and they make about $20,000 to $38,000. And these are based on, by the way, 4-person households. It's not a lot of money. May own a home, but it's not going to be the biggest mansion on the block, and most likely renting. And the working class is often depicted, you know, in a certain way of, you know, having that hard living life, and they may maintain a job, but it's not easy. And that's the whole owner worker thing. When the owners are doing bad, those workers tend to be laid off and experience those struggles. Blue and pink collar jobs are found, the definition of that is associated with this class because usually it's low skilled labor like secretarial work or some sort of foreman work, four-person work, where we often see factory workers, which at times had been, you know, mostly associated with men, and women being secretaries. Those changing dynamics, though, are coming around to where we're not necessarily blue and pinking this anymore, because you are seeing more male nurses, you are seeing more male secretaries, and more people. Obviously, women are in manufacturing big time. In fact, on a global scale, women are in the manufacturing jobs more than men because they're cheaper to hire. And we'll talk about that some other time, but it's a real piece. Lower class then is a level that often doesn't have a stable skill set or a maintained occupation over time. Their social class is composed of those who work part-time sometimes or not at all, whose household income is typically low. It's less than $20,000 a year. That's well below the poverty line, and roughly 20% of our households are in that position right now. And that's pretty high. No accumulated wealth. There's lower education, if any, beyond high school, and it may not, a lot of people may not have finished high school in this position. And so we see the struggles where, you know, people are really trying, and it is tough. It is, especially if people are not able to migrate or move to places where jobs are available. We see large levels of unemployment, and this can be just really rough. And that's not even, so it's kind of where they're stuck. The underclass is this next level that a lot of times is confused with the lower class. But it's kind of like if you're in the lower class at the bottom tier of that $20,000 a year and things go bad, you teeter between this and the underclass, which is situated at the bottom of the class system, and it's composed of people. And in our United States, it's overrepresented by ethnic minorities. We tend to find this being a place where we really see race and ethnicity and gender, because women are also often at the bottom of this as well. And they're just trapped by that cycle of poverty, and they may move up into a lower class situation and may even get to working class on occasion, but you constantly see that pull. And it can be a real struggle. And then I got, sorry. So social mobility, you see being such a big piece in this, where people and individuals and groups in their positions can't necessarily break that stratified. And when we think about stratification, I want you to think, you know, really hard layers of rock, for example, and trying to break through that. It's just really difficult if you're wanting to be at a comfortable level. I've heard the statistic that if a family can make $75,000 in a household, that's the first time that you actually feel like you can not be worried every day. And that's still even tough with insurance and childcare and things like that with folks. So ethnic minorities as a whole have disadvantage in the class system. Our statistics over and over again often support this, and we continue to see that social mobility is limited by that stratification, and it still favors whites. And some of that is absolutely tied to the issues of slavery and people being owned at one time and not being able to inherit. And lots of people have family that, you know, at the, founding of this country, with, Native Americans, we see this as well, where when all of this United States experiment and becoming a nation state happened, we started to see this stratification begin. And then the capitalist system was also developing at that point. And so all of these things have played such a huge part on our history because we've attached a dollar to the worth of a person. And it doesn't mean that that may philosophically be how you look at things, but this is what we do when we're looking at the resources that people have. And it can be very difficult to talk about. There's also ways in which we have to recognize how people are socially mobile. So you can either be intragenerational mobile or intergenerationally mobile. And there is a difference. Intragenerational mobility is movement up or down the social stratification hierarchy within the course of a personal career. So, for example, I was raised in a family. My parents were working class. My mom started working at Boeing, and my dad was a truck driver. But as I was the youngest in the household, my kids moved out that were older than me, my siblings. They moved in from working to the bottom of the lower middle class. I was then able to go to school. I went to school and I got a seminary degree, and the pastorate actually is in your mainline churches pays well. And I've had some positions over time, and I've been able to go back get my PhD. Right now I'm able to, with my husband's income, be able to work part-time at ESU, and all of that has moved us into, we would be at this point at the lower level of the upper middle class. That's my status, but my parents still remains at the lower middle class level. And that is the intragenerational is my move in my lifetime. If the whole thing, if we would have had children, my husband and I did not have children, but if my husband and I chose to have children and we both moved up this, to upper middle class pretty strong, because his parents were pastors, but they were, would be considered a little bit more of the middle class or the lower middle class still. If we would have maintained those positions and, over time as we tried to maintain jobs at higher level incomes and getting more wealth, if we would have had children, they would have been born into that upper middle class. If we were able to maintain that, not, we still got a long way to go with our student debt. But anyway, intergenerational is then when a whole generation moves up or moves down. And we do see people move up and we see whole families move down. Let's say that parents get ill, medical bills take over, people were in middle class situation and jobs moved away, and or a hurricane came through and destroyed everything and there was no insurance. We've seen very quickly people move socially mobile going down this class system. And that can be one person that does that, which would be the intragenerational mobility, or if it's an entire family, it's intergenerational. Exchange mobility is where the positions of socioeconomic scale, such as talented people moving up and down economic hierarchy with less talented moving down, is what people will tell you. Hey, if people just get their jobs and they get these positions and move up and down, they'll have the ability to reach their goals. Well, yes, there is some truth to some of that, but really, if you're born and you have more resources, based on, what race or ethnicity or what gender you are, that can cause issues as far as the skill set. People seeing that skill set, because you may have the skill set, but you still have to fight past those other ceilings. The other thing is that we have such a wide gap right now that there are people sitting at the top of the socioeconomic scale that honestly don't have not, they may be educated at a certain level, but there's just no way that a CEO really works 300 times more than their average worker. It just, they are not 300 times better at doing that job typically. And that's what we're seeing at this level. And it's even increasing more because based on their salary, based on their income. So exchange mobility looks like it's equal. It's a zero-sum game kind of deal, and it's not. There's a lot of times where people have advantages, and just because you have the skill set doesn't mean you're automatically going to make the same as another person. that may have some advantages to their life. Even it could be part of the country that they're living in. You know, a Kansan may be different than a Texan or a person from Florida or New York or California. So it's not just about that sense of race, ethnicity. It also might be region. Structural mobility is resulting in changes where numbers of kinds of jobs are available in society. So there's a lot of times where we don't have the structure for people to move up and down this system. And right now, people have said the middle class has been stretched quite a bit to where the structure of middle class jobs is just kind of gone. We are really seeing that have an effect. There are, though, however, different technical fields that are developing. And so we're seeing people have to move into those sectors. And like I said about the doctors versus nurse practitioners, a new structure is being developed in the medical field. So that's what you need to pay attention with structural mobility is there are changes in the numbers of kinds of jobs that are available based on what's going on in the society and what people want and need. Downward mobility is when an individual moves down. Basically, I've talked about it already. Down the income scale, status goes lower. Short range downward mobility is where it occurs where individual may move down just for a little bit. So I had a dad that was a truck driver. And so when he was laid off, short range downward mobility for our family. You know, we ate a lot more macaroni and cheese, and I worked my own job in high school and paid for my own car. And while things were tough, we, you know, watched that. Man, my sorry about my spelling. It's supposed to be equal. So I'll go back and change that later. But these are things where the social downward mobility has a short-term effect, but usually can bounce back from it. Whereas downward mobility as a whole, typically you don't. Then poverty happens when, again, you are not able to meet the basic needs, basically. It's the minimal requirements. Now, the interesting thing is there's two kinds of poverty, just like the mobility. Absolutes, where the minimal requirements necessary to sustain a healthy existence, they're just not available to you. You may have a job. You may be working as hard as you can, but you have no network. You're in the wrong area. You can't migrate. You have kids that you're trying to raise, or you yourself are aging and you have health issues. There's all kinds of things that contribute to absolute poverty, and you just can't get those minimals. It doesn't mean you won't be a happy person. I've often said some of the people that are in absolute poverty just blow my mind, but they deserve, in my opinion, you know, many of these folks are working and they're working poor. But they're still in that absolute condition where they really can't ever get the resources. Relative is defined according to living standards of majority of given society. And this is where I talk about this, which is some people can be in absolute poverty and not get out of that cycle. Relative poverty might be where they're in that cycle, but you know, they are working the systems in a way that is sustainable, and they're having some sort of health, maybe with the networks they're connected with, the agencies they're connected with. They may be involved in religious or social communities. And so on the scale of what the poverty level is, they are not making the income they need. They don't have the wealth, but they may be living in standards. For example, in small towns, we see a lot of people make a lot less than the national incomes on average. But because they have such a small town and everybody knows each other and cares for each other, their poverty is not the same kind of experience sometimes. I'm not going to say that the rural people don't suffer, because there's a lot of that going on too. But again, another argument. In 2011, a family of four poverty line was 22,350. We're going to probably see that change again in the U.S. Census. It's an official government measure, what we use, and this is something you really need to know. This number, these numbers that we call the poverty line, were created after World War II, when development was happening around the world, and we didn't have a way to measure, you know, where people's status was. So I'm not going to get into all the details, but basically the powers that be that decided to help with the development, a lot of it came out of the Marshall Plan, and a lot of it came out of called Bretton Woods. As people redeveloped after World War II, a line was set. So a farmer one day without the poverty line set may have woken up and not thought they were impoverished because, they had that relative poverty maybe, but they really didn't think about being compared to other people at the income status. And then the next day we have policy that says this is the poverty line. Now it's become a very useful tool, and especially in urban and rural areas, that helps us to understand, income and level of income and what people need to be sustaining. But it's still also something you have to keep in mind that we have constructed this. It's a social construction. So, but that's what it was in 2011. That'll probably be on your next exam. And then finally, working poor. We're seeing such a high level of increase in working poor, where people are living above a certain level of earnings, where they may not be able to get the resources because they have a job and they're expected to have a job, but they're really not too far above the poverty line or ever get out of it. So we see a lot of elderly, for example, that are working extra jobs. People say, minimum wage, you can't work on minimum wage and get rent. You can do all kinds of background research on that. And working poor is a strong condition that's going on right now. And so 25% of the people living in poverty right now, they work. It's just an assumption that people don't work when you're in poverty. And it's like a large portion of them are 4.9 million full-time, 5.5 million are women and under the poverty line. In 2/3 of the poor white, but the income for whites versus Black to Latinos is 2/3 of what the whites make. So once again, we see race and ethnicity play a part in that as well. The last thing is I need to say, and this has been a long lecture, but you only have one video this week on top of this, so hopefully you can get through that. The feminization of poverty. We are seeing more and more women that are basically in that poverty line and below it. And there's a lot of times, there's a lot of social work we can look at from different angles with this, single motherhood. There's a lot of times where we are seeing women just, without children that are just not able to get their foot up. And so that's based on, once again, where in the class system we see that culture then develop, where the reproduction of poverty continues to cycle. And we often see dependency cultures where individuals who rely on the state welfare provision are entering the labor market, and the real way to make it is to be dependent on that system. And even as much as you might have the will, a lot of times there is no way. And that's something, if you're in social work especially, you'll see a lot of that. All of our areas are affected by this, based on, there's no easy answer to it. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done from lots of different sides, but we do know that these things exist. And what we don't want is social exclusion, where the outcome of multiple deprivations create these groups that are not able to fully participate. Our society, gets basically torn apart. And we see a lot of this going on right now. It's not the only time it's happened, by the way, but it happens all the time. And it's for social and political life in society where they live. It's just, you see that exclusion where there's a lot of us and them, a lot of those in and out groups we've talked about start to develop during this time. So the final thing I will always come back to is that teaching people to have agency, to think, act, and make choices, to have the ability and the resources to do that, to have ways in which their choices create opportunity, and to be able to have that sense of not being independent by yourself and picking yourself up by your bootstraps, but being able to work with others and be valued, and not to be thought of as just, partial human or partial valued. It doesn't have to go all the way, like the video says, to socialism, even though that might be where some of you land with your political ideas on that. It's just, it has to change in some ways, because sustaining this is going to be very difficult. Thanks again for listening. If you have any questions, text me 913-553-0267, and I hope you have a good week.